The night shift is a world apart. When the sun goes down and most people retreat to the safety of their homes, a different kind of life begins. The city changes, the air feels heavier, the shadows stretch longer, and the silence is never quite complete. For those who work through the darkness, security guards, hospital staff, truck drivers, janitors, and all the others who keep the world running while the rest of us sleep. Night is not just a time, but a territory. And in that territory, strange things happen. Things that don't make sense in the daylight. Things that, if you're lucky, you can explain away. But sometimes, you can't. Sometimes, the night leaves you with questions that never get answered. I've spent years collecting stories from people who work the graveyard shift. Some are just odd, the kind of thing you laugh about later. Others are unsettling, the kind that make you check over your shoulder when you're alone. And then there are the stories that stick with you, the ones that change the way you look at the world after dark. Tonight, I want to share 3 of those stories. 3 accounts from night shift workers who saw, heard, or felt something they couldn't explain. I'll tell you right now, story number 3 is the one that still keeps me up at night. But let's start at the beginning. The first story comes from a man named Eric, who worked as a security guard at a sprawling, half-abandoned industrial park on the edge of a Midwestern city. The place had once been a hub of manufacturing, but by the time Eric started, most of the buildings were empty shells, their windows boarded up, their parking lots cracked and overgrown. His job was simple: walk the grounds every hour, check the locks, and make sure no one was trespassing. Most nights, it was boring. He'd listen to the radio, drink too much coffee, and count down the hours until sunrise. But there was one building, the old machine shop, that always made him uneasy. It was the largest structure on the property, a cavernous space filled with rusted equipment and the ghosts of 100 forgotten projects. The company that owned the park kept it locked up tight, but Eric had the keys. Part of his job was to walk through the machine shop once a night, just to make sure everything was secure. He told me that the first time he set foot inside, he felt it, a pressure in the air, like the room was holding its breath. The darkness inside was different, heavier somehow, and his flashlight never seemed to cut through it completely. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the concrete floor, bouncing back at him in strange, distorted ways. He tried to tell himself it was just nerves, just the natural creepiness of an empty building at night. But the feeling never went away. One night, about 3 months into the job, Eric was making his usual rounds. It was just after 2 a.m., the hour when the world feels most deserted. He unlocked the machine shop door, stepped inside, and immediately knew something was wrong. The air was colder than usual, and there was a smell, something metallic and sharp, like old blood. He swept his flashlight across the room, half expecting to see a raccoon or a stray cat, but the beam caught on something else, a figure, standing at the far end of the shop, just beyond the reach of the light. Eric froze. The figure didn't move. He called out, "Hey, you're not supposed to be in here." No response. He took a step forward, and the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows. He thought maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him, that the darkness and the machinery had combined to create a human shape. But then he heard it, a low, scraping sound, like metal dragging across concrete. It came from the far corner of the room, where the old lathes were stored. He shone his light in that direction, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped. Eric's heart was pounding. He backed out of the building, locked the door behind him, and finished his shift sitting in his car with the engine running. The next day, he told his supervisor what had happened. They checked the security cameras, but the footage from inside the machine shop was blank, just static, from the moment Eric entered until the moment he left. Eric stayed on the job for another 6 months, but he never went into the machine shop alone again. He said he could never shake the feeling that something was waiting for him in the dark, something that didn't want to be seen. That's the kind of story you hear a lot from night shift workers. The sense that you're not alone, even when you know you should be. The feeling that the darkness is watching you, that the silence is hiding something. Most people can shrug it off, blame it on fatigue or imagination, but sometimes the night pushes back. The second story comes from a woman named Marisol who worked as a nurse in a small-town hospital. Night shifts in hospitals are their own kind of strange. The building is never truly quiet. There's always the hum of machines, the distant beeping of monitors, the soft shuffle of feet in the hallways. But there's a rhythm to it, a pattern that becomes familiar over time. Marisol had been working nights for years, and she thought she'd seen it all. But there was one patient she would never forget. He was an older man, brought in after a fall at home. He was confused, disoriented, and spoke in a language Marisol didn't recognize. The doctors said he had a head injury, but there was something else about him. something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. He refused to sleep, staring at the ceiling with wide, unblinking eyes. Whenever Marisol checked on him, he would turn to look at her, his gaze sharp and intense. One night, just before dawn, Marisol was making her rounds when she heard a voice coming from the man's room. It was low and urgent, a string of words she couldn't understand. She opened the door and found him sitting up in bed, eyes fixed on the window. The room was freezing cold, colder than the rest of the ward. Marisol checked the thermostat, but it was set to normal. She tried to calm the man, but he just kept repeating the same phrase over and over, his voice rising in pitch. Marisol called for help, but by the time another nurse arrived, the man had gone silent. He was lying back on the bed, eyes closed, breathing shallow. The cold in the room lingered, a biting chill that seemed to seep from the walls. The other nurse checked the window, but it was locked tight. They wrapped the man in extra blankets and called the doctor, but there was nothing more to be done until morning. When Marisol returned to the room an hour later, the man was gone. Not dead, just gone. The bed was empty, the blankets neatly folded, the pillow undisturbed. The door was still locked from the inside, and the window hadn't been opened. Security was called, and a search was launched, but man was never found. His chart, his clothes, even his name seemed to vanish from the hospital records. It was as if he had never been there at all. Marisol tried to talk to her co-workers about it, but no one wanted to listen. The official story was that the man had been transferred to another facility, but Marisol knew that wasn't true. She'd checked the logs herself. There was no record of a transfer, no ambulance called, no paperwork filed. The only evidence that he had ever existed was a single note in the night shift log, written in Marisol's own hand, patient in 214 missing, room cold, no explanation. She said that after that night, she started noticing other things, small things. At first, a shadow moving in the corner of her eye, a cold spot in the hallway, a whisper of sound that didn't belong. She began to dread her shifts, the long hours between midnight and dawn when the hospital seemed to slip out of the world and into some other place. She transferred 2-day shifts a few months later, but she never forgot the man in room 214, or the way he looked at her, as if he knew something she didn't. Stories like Marisol's are harder to dismiss. They don't fit neatly into the categories of imagination or coincidence. They leave a mark, a sense that the world is stranger than we want to believe, and for those who work the night shift, that strangeness is always just beneath the surface. Now, before we get to the third story, the one you won't believe, I want to talk about something I've noticed in all these accounts. There's a pattern, a kind of logic to the weirdness of the night. It's not just about being tired or alone. It's about the way the world changes when most people aren't looking. The rules are different. Time stretches and contracts. Places you know by heart become unfamiliar. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, you catch a glimpse of something that doesn't belong. That brings us to the third story. This one comes from a man named David, who worked as a night janitor at a high-rise office building in a major city. David was a quiet guy, the kind of person who preferred to be invisible. He liked the solitude of the night shift, the empty hallways and the hum of the city outside. His job was simple: clean the offices, empty the trash, and make sure everything was ready for the morning crew. The building was old, with a history that stretched back nearly a century. It had been renovated many times, but there were still places where the past showed through. Ornate moldings, marble floors, heavy wooden doors. David liked to imagine the people who had worked there over the years, the stories the building could tell if it wanted to. One night, around 3 a.m., David was working on the 14th floor. The offices were empty, the lights dimmed to save energy. He was vacuuming the hallway when he heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a desk. He turned off the vacuum and listened. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, coming from one of the corner offices. David walked down the hall, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. The tapping grew louder as he approached. He stopped outside the office door and listened. The sound was definitely coming from inside. He knocked, just in case someone was working late, but there was no answer. He opened the door and stepped inside. The office was empty. The desk was clear, the chair pushed in, the computer off. But the tapping continued, coming from the far corner of the room. David walked over and found nothing but a filing cabinet and a potted plant. The tapping stopped. He stood there for a moment, heart pounding, then shook his head and laughed. He must have imagined it, he thought. Maybe the building was settling, or a pipe was knocking in the walls. He finished cleaning the office and moved on to the next floor. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. He kept catching glimpses of movement in the reflections of the windows. shadows that didn't match his own. The air felt heavy, charged with static. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his work, but the feeling only grew stronger. Around 4 a.m. David was cleaning the restroom on the 12th floor when he heard the tapping again. This time it was louder, more insistent. It echoed off the tile walls, filling the small space with sound. David dropped his mop and backed out of the room, his skin crawling. The tapping followed him down the hallway, growing faster and more frantic. He broke into a run, not stopping until he reached the lobby. He spent the rest of his shift in the security office, watching the monitors and trying to calm down. When the morning crew arrived, he told them what had happened. They laughed it off, said the building was full of strange noises, especially at night. But David knew what he'd heard. He quit the job a week later, unable to face another night in that building. David's story is the kind that lingers. It's not just the tapping, or the shadows, or the way the buildings seem to come alive after midnight. It's the sense of being watched, of being singled out by something that shouldn't exist. When I spoke to David, he told me he still dreams about that office building. Sometimes he's walking the halls, mop in hand, and the lights start to flicker. Sometimes he's in the restroom, and the tapping starts up again, louder and louder, until it drowns out everything else. He always wakes up before he finds out what's making the noise. What's interesting about these stories is how ordinary they seem at first. A security guard doing his rounds, a nurse checking on a patient, a janitor cleaning empty offices. These are the people who see the world when it's at its quietest. When the rest of us are asleep and the rules of reality seem to loosen, they're not looking for trouble. They're just trying to do their jobs. But the night has a way of finding them. I've heard dozens of stories like these over the years. Some are more dramatic, full apparitions, objects moving on their own, voices whispering in the dark. Others are subtle, just a feeling of unease or a moment when time seems to skip. But they all share a common thread, the sense that the night is different, that it holds secrets the day can't touch. There's a theory among night shift workers that the world is thinner after midnight, that the boundaries between what's real and what isn't get blurry. Maybe it's the lack of sunlight, or the way the city empties out, or just the fatigue that comes from being awake when you're supposed to be asleep. But whatever the reason, things happen at night that don't happen during the day. Take, for example, the story of a truck driver named Leela. She spent years hauling freight across the country, driving through the night to make her deliveries on time. She told me about a stretch overway in the Nevada desert, a place where the road runs straight for miles and the stars seem close enough to touch. One night, around 2 a.m., she saw headlights in her rearview mirror, another truck gaining on her fast. She moved over to let it pass, but the truck never pulled alongside. Instead, the headlights stayed just behind her, matching her speed exactly. Lila tried to get a look at the driver, but the glare from the lights was too bright. She sped up, slowed down, even pulled off at a rest stop, but the truck followed her every move. Finally, after an hour of this, the headlights vanished. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, as if the truck had never existed. Leela finished her run and never saw those lights again, but she still wonders what was following her that night. Or consider the story of a hotel night manager named Sam. He worked at an old inn on the edge of a small town, a place with creaky floors and a reputation for being haunted. Most nights were uneventful, just the usual late check-ins and the occasional noise complaint. But one night, Sam got a call from a guest in room 307. The woman on the other end sounded terrified. She said someone was knocking on her door, over and over, but when she looked through the peephole, there was no one there. Sam went up to check, but the hallway was empty. He reassured the guest and went back to the front desk. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the woman was crying. She said the knocking had started up again, but now it was coming from inside the room, from the closet. Sam called security, and together they went back to 307. They found the guest huddled on the bed, shaking. The closet door was closed, but when Sam opened it, there was nothing inside but a faint, lingering smell of old perfume. Stories like these are everywhere if you know who to ask. They're not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a feeling, a moment when the world seems to tilt, but for the people who experience them, they're real. They're reminders that the night is not as empty as it seems. I think that's what makes these stories so compelling. They're not about monsters or demons or things that go bump in the night. At least, not in the way we usually imagine. They're about the unknown, the things we can't explain. They're about the moments when the world feels bigger and stranger than we want to admit. And maybe that's why we tell these stories. Maybe it's a way of making sense of the things that don't make sense. Maybe it's a way of reminding ourselves that we're not alone in the dark, that other people have felt the same fear, the same wonder, the same sense of being watched by something just out of sight. As I listen to these stories, I'm struck by how often they end the same way. The night ends, the sun comes up, and the world goes back to normal. The strange things fade into memory, and life goes on. But the people who live through them are changed. They carry the night with them, a little piece of darkness that never quite goes away. Sometimes, the stories are passed around like warnings, little rituals to keep the night at bay. A nurse tells a new hire to always knock before entering the supply closet, even if it's supposed to be empty. A security guard leaves the lights on in a certain hallway, no matter what the energy Savingolasi says. A janitor refuses to clean the basement alone, even if it means getting written up. These habits become part of the job, unspoken rules that everyone follows without really knowing why. They're a way of acknowledging the strangeness, of giving it a place so it doesn't take over everything. But not all stories are shared so openly. Some are kept quiet, locked away like secrets. There's a kind of loneliness that comes with working the night shift, a sense that you're out of step with the rest of the world. When something strange happens, it's easy to doubt yourself. Maybe you were just tired, maybe you imagined it, maybe it's better not to talk about it at all. I remember talking to a woman named Priya who worked as a dispatcher for a taxi company in a big city. Her office was a tiny room above the garage, with a window that looked out over the empty lot. Most nights she was the only one there. She'd listen to the radio chatter, track the cabs on her computer, and wait for the sun to come up. She told me about a night when she saw a man standing in the lot, just outside the pool of light from the street. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and he never moved. She watched him for nearly an hour, expecting him to leave or come closer, but he just stood there, perfectly still. Priya called down to the garage, but no one answered. She thought about calling the police, but she couldn't quite explain what was wrong. The man wasn't doing anything, he was just there. Eventually, the sun started to rise, and the man disappeared. Priya never saw him again, but she started keeping the blinds closed after that. She said it was easier not to look. There's a vulnerability to the night, a sense that anything could happen. The world feels bigger, emptier, and more dangerous. But there's also a kind of beauty in it. The quiet, the solitude, the way the city lights shimmer in the darkness. For some people, the night shift is a refuge, a place where they can be themselves without the noise and chaos of the day. For others, it's a test, a way of proving they can handle whatever the darkness throws at them. I've noticed that the people who thrive on the night shift are often the ones who are most comfortable with uncertainty. They don't need everything to make sense. They're used to living with unanswered questions, to moving through a world that doesn't always add up. They're the ones who can laugh off a strange noise or a flicker of movement in the corner of their eye. But even they have limits. Even they have stories they don't like to tell. One of the most unsettling stories I've ever heard came from a man named Tom, who worked as a maintenance supervisor at a large shopping mall. Tom was a skeptic, the kind of guy who didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. He prided himself on being practical, on finding logical explanations for everything, but there was one night he couldn't explain. It was late, after midnight, and the mall was empty. Tom was doing his rounds, checking the fire exits and making sure all the doors were locked. He was walking past the food court when he heard music, soft, tinny, like it was coming from an old radio. He followed the sound to one of the closed restaurants, a burger place that had been out of business for months. The lights were off. The gate was down, but the music was definitely coming from inside. Tom tried the gate, but it was locked. He peered through the slats and saw a figure standing behind the counter. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was humming along with the music, wiping down the counter with a rag. Tom called out, but she didn't respond. He radioed for security, but by the time they arrived, the music had stopped and the woman was gone. They searched the restaurant, but there was no sign that anyone had been there. The counters were dusty. The floor was covered in debris, and the old radio was unplugged. Tom tried to laugh it off, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see. He started carrying a flashlight on his rounds, even in the well-lit parts of the mall. He never heard the music again, but he always walked a little faster past the food court after that. Stories like Tom's are a reminder that the night doesn't belong to us. We move through it, but we don't control it. There are things out there, memories, echoes, shadows, that don't care about our schedules or our routines. They exist on their own terms, and sometimes, if we're unlucky, we cross paths with them. For every story that gets told, there are dozens more that never leave the night. Some are too strange, too personal, or too frightening to share. Others fade with time, becoming half-remembered dreams or jokes told over coffee at the end of a long shift. but every night worker I've ever met has at least one story. A moment when the world slipped sideways, when the familiar became unfamiliar, when the darkness pressed in a little too close. Sometimes these stories are about loss. A nurse who swears she saw a patient who'd passed away weeks before, standing at the end of the hallway, just watching. A truck driver who picked up a hitchhiker on a lonely stretch of road, only to find the passenger's seat empty a few miles later. A hotel clerk who heard laughter coming from an empty ballroom, the sound echoing long after it should have faded. These moments are like ripples in the fabric of the night, reminders that the past is never as far away as we think. Other times the stories are about connection, a security guard who found a stray dog on his rounds, and for a few weeks the two of them kept each other company through the long hours. A janitor who discovered a hidden message scratched into the paint of a stairwell, just a name and a date, but it made her feel less alone. A dispatcher who listened to the same late-night radio show every shift, the host's voice a lifeline in the darkness. These small moments of comfort are just as real, just as important, as the scares and the mysteries. But the stories that stick with me the most are the ones that don't fit into any category. The ones that leave you with more questions than answers. Like the story of a paramedic named Alex, who responded to a call at an abandoned house on the edge of town. The place was supposed to be empty, but the lights were on and the front door was open. Alex and his partner went inside, calling out, but no one answered. They found a woman sitting in the living room, staring at the wall. She didn't speak, didn't move, just sat there as if she was waiting for something. Alex checked her pulse. Steady, normal. He tried to get her attention, but she wouldn't respond. His partner called for backup, and while they waited, Alex looked around the room. There were photographs on the walls, all of the same woman, at different ages, in different places. But in every photo she was alone, no family, no friends, just her. When the police arrived, the woman finally stood up and walked out the front door, disappearing into the night. They never found her, and the house was empty when they searched it again. Alex still wonders who she was, and what she was waiting for, or the story of a baker named Rosa, who worked the early morning shift at a 24-hour diner. She'd arrive at 3 a.m. when the city was still asleep, and start preparing the day's bread and pastries. One morning she found a note taped to the back door. It was written in neat, careful handwriting. "Thank you for the bread. It helps." Rosa thought it was a prank, but the notes kept coming, always polite, always grateful, always signed with a single initial. She never saw who left them, but she started leaving out an extra loaf each night, just in case. The notes stopped after a few months, but Rosa still thinks about the person who needed her bread, and what it meant to them. These stories remind us that the night is not just a time of fear, but a time of possibility. It's a space where the ordinary and the extraordinary can coexist, where the boundaries between past and present, real and unreal, are blurred. For those who work through the darkness, the night is both a challenge and a gift, a chance to see the world in a different light, to find meaning in the shadows. And yet, for all the wonder and beauty the night can hold, there's always an edge of danger. The unknown is never far away. The stories I've shared tonight are just a few of the countless experiences that night shift workers have had. Some are easy to explain, others defy explanation, but they all have one thing in common. They remind us that the world is bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than we like to admit. So the next time you find yourself awake in the small hours, think about the people who are out there, keeping watch while the rest of us sleep. The security guards, the nurses, the janitors, the drivers, the dispatchers. They're the ones who see the world as it really is, unfiltered, unguarded, and full of secrets. And if you ever get the chance to hear their stories, listen closely. You might just learn something about the night, and about yourself. Because in the end, the night belongs to all of us. It's where our fears live, but also our hopes. It's where we confront the things we can't explain, and where we find the courage to keep going, even when the darkness seems endless. The stories of the night shift are stories of survival, of resilience, of finding light in the darkest places. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they're stories of wonder. But even as the sun rises and the world returns to its familiar rhythms, the stories of the night don't simply vanish. They linger, tucked away in the memories of those who lived them, whispered in break rooms and over early morning coffee, shared in quiet moments between co-workers who understand what it means to be awake when everyone else is dreaming. These stories become part of the fabric of the night shift, woven into the routines and rituals that help people make sense of the hours between dusk and dawn. For some, the stories are a source of pride, a badge of honor that marks them as survivors of the night's mysteries. For others, They're a burden, a reminder of things they'd rather forget. But for all night shift workers, these stories are a testament to the resilience and adaptability that the job demands. It takes a certain kind of person to thrive in the darkness, to find meaning and purpose in the quiet hours, when the rest of the world is asleep. And maybe that's the real lesson of these stories. The night is not just a backdrop for fear and uncertainty. It's a proving ground, a place where people are tested in ways that daylight never demands. It's where courage is forged, not in grand gestures, but in the small, steady acts of showing up, night after night, no matter what the darkness holds. It's where people learn to trust their instincts, to rely on each other, and to find comfort in the routines that keep them grounded. There's a kind of magic in that, a quiet heroism that often goes unnoticed. The world depends on night shift workers, even if it rarely acknowledges them. They keep the lights on, the streets safe, the hospitals running, the goods moving. They are the unseen guardians of the night, the ones who hold the line between order and chaos, between the known and the unknown. And as long as there are people willing to work through the darkness, there will be stories of strange encounters, of unexplained phenomena, of moments when the world feels just a little bit different. These stories remind us that the night is not empty, that it is alive with possibility and danger and wonder. They remind us that, no matter how much we try to control our environment, there are always forces at work that we can't fully understand. So if you ever find yourself working the night shift, or even just awake in the small hours, remember that you're not alone. You're part of a long tradition, a community of people who have faced the darkness and come out the other side. You're part of a world that is richer and more mysterious than you might think. And if you ever experience something you can't explain, a shadow that moves where it shouldn't, a voice that calls your name when no one is there, a feeling that you're being watched, don't be afraid to share your story. You might be surprised at how many people have their own tales to tell, how many have felt the same chill, heard the same sound, seen the same impossible thing. The night is full of secrets, but it's also full of connections, of shared experiences, that bind us together in ways we don't always recognize. In the end, maybe that's what these stories are really about, not just the fear or the mystery, but the way they bring us together, the way they remind us that, even in the darkest hours, we are never truly alone. There is always someone else out there, keeping watch, listening, waiting for the dawn. So here's to the night shift workers, the ones who see what others miss, who face what others fear, who keep the world turning while the rest of us sleep. Your stories matter, your experiences matter, and the night, for all its strangeness and uncertainty, is a little less lonely because of you. And as you finish listening to these stories, maybe you'll find yourself thinking differently the next time you pass a hospital glowing in the darkness, or see a lone security guard making rounds, or spot a janitor mopping the floor of an empty building. Maybe you'll remember that the night is not just a time to be endured, but a world to be explored, a world where anything can happen, and where the most ordinary people can become the heroes of their own stories. Because in the end, the night belongs to all of us, and its stories, strange, beautiful, terrifying, and true, are waiting to be told.